Well, Black Lives Matter is renewing its calls to defund the police as the organization marks a major milestone.
That's right. Activists founded the global movement 10 years ago. You may remember it was the acquittal of the man who fatally shot 17-year-old Trayvon Martin, which spurred the creation of Black Lives Matter on July 13th, 2013. Since then, the movement has grown significantly to influence politics, law enforcement, and national conversations about race and racism in and outside of the United States. Joining us now is DeRay Mckesson. He's the co-founder and executive director of Campaign Zero, an organization that advances efforts supporting communities to redefine public safety in ways not involving police. Viewers may remember you would wear a blue vest as a kind of visual symbol. You don't have that on today, but DeRay, it's great to have you with us. Talk to us about where things look from your point of view now, because one of the main focuses, from 10 years ago was the relationship between the police and Black communities all over the country. What's changed since then?
Yeah, so it's true that so many people are awakened by the killing of Trayvon Martin and certainly the acquittal. And I would be remiss if I didn't remind us all about the 10 years of Ferguson that will be next year. And for so many people, the protests began in Ferguson. And I'm interested in that conversation a year from now. But when I think about what has changed in 10 years, I think that people are talking about the police more. People understand that this is no longer a fringe issue, that this isn't a happenstance happening one or two places. Remember, today, the police kill average of 3 people every single day. A third of all the people killed by a stranger are actually killed by a police officer in this country. And there have been some big structural wins. So you think about big police reform bill in Maryland. There are a handful of states that restricted or banned no-knock raids in the wake of the killing of Breonna Taylor. And about 19 states did use of force policy changes in 2021, the single biggest reduction of the power of the police in American history. So things are changing, and I think there's a lot more room to go.
Yeah, DeRay, there's still so much progress that needs to be made. There are some criticisms that people use Black Lives Matter as a banner to virtue signal, but are not actually doing anything about it. What do you have to say to people who are now looking at 10 years of Black Lives Matter and where they should be putting their efforts to actually make substantial changes?
Yeah, so I think that we learned a lot in 10 years. I think that we should have been more public about the idea that there's no one organization that is the movement, that there isn't an organization, anyone that decides what is or is not true about this space. That what was beautiful about Ferguson is that people came outside without there being one organization or one set of leaders, and people said this is not right, and people organized all around the country. So what is true is that people started this movement, not 1, 2, or 3 people, a whole set of people came outside. And we also should unearth the first utterance of Black Lives Matter, which was actually on Twitter and not Facebook, and be honest about reclaiming what is true about the way people came together in those years. And next year with 2014, remember, Ferguson was a watershed moment for this country about how the media reported on the police, about how people came to the streets and how people started to question what was happening.
It's a good point to make. It's more than just a phrase, right? It's kind of a movement and a belief, and businesses can't just put the sign in the window. I think a lot of you and other activists have been making sure they follow up on commitments they make. DeRay Mckesson, great to have you with us today. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, DeRay.
Good to be here.